to contract training. Today, we're going to be talking about buyer agency, and I'm using a presentation on buyer agency from last year or 2 years ago, but I've updated it, edited it a little bit, and it's something that you can always refer to because buyer agency is with us almost 100%. And I think a lot of people take it for granted without realizing the responsibilities that go with buyer agency. So I do want to say I just realized that the latest legal update from WRA, the January 2024 legal update, is all about buyer agency. It goes from the basics to the complicated, and lots of buyer agent tips in there. So it might be something you want to find. Go to WRA.org, look for the link, and save it into your own private files as something that you can refer to. Because buyer agency isn't simple. It's pretty complicated. Now, if any of you have good experiences with buyer agency, I'd like you to share some of your questions today. If you're new to your license and this is a startup for buyer agency, again, I'm covering the basics all the way to a little more complicated about the compensation. So that's what we're going to be viewing today. Now I'm going to share my screen with the slideshow. You can mute yourself while you're doing this, but if you have a question during the slideshow at any time, either raise your hand or just unmute yourself and ask me as we go along. Any questions before we start? Good. So can you all see my screen with the slideshow? Good. So again, this is Develop Loyal Clients with Buyer Agency, WRA Legal Update, January 24. It's got everything from A to Z about buyer agency in it. But this update is being transparent in all discussions of compensation. So the new legal lawsuits that were out there, we have to be transparent with the buyer, making sure that the buyer fully understands what his responsibilities are. So, going. A buyer agency, you have to realize, is not your buyer agency. It's your buyer, obviously, through some connections or referral, but that buyer agency agreement is with the firm, with Keller Williams. And you being an agent with Keller Williams, you have the rights to that agreement with that buyer. That buyer can be your client, and you can call him a client. When you write an offer with that buyer, you make sure that on the first two lines, you strike everything except that you are representing the buyer. Make sure that that's clear when you're showing a property. You want to make sure that you let the listing service know that you are a buyer's agent. Big difference than being working with somebody as a customer. A fiduciary agreement means you give everything to the benefit of your client, that you are working for the success of your client and the benefit of the client, and not your own or not anybody else. So when you sign up a buyer agency agreement, it's a relationship created when a buyer agrees that an independent agent may act on his behalf. Oh, there. It's so touchy. In a purchase rental agreement, it becomes a fiduciary agreement where the buyer becomes a client of the agent's brokerage and not exclusive of yours, which means you can designate this buyer agency relationship to any other Keller Williams agent. And that buyer agency agreement would still be in place. Remember that buyer agency agreement is the counterpart to the listing contract, where the seller becomes a client of the agent brokerage. And because we at Keller Williams have a lot of buyer agent agreements and a lot of listing agreements, that means that we can designate agency to buyer's agents and to seller's agents. Try and get this back to the slideshow. So why should you practice buyer agency? I used to have this argument with agents a long time ago when I was a manager from 2002 at another firm. At that time, we were so used to assumed agency and not using the form and practicing basically illegally for a long time. It was very hard to convince some of the seasoned agents that they are better off using buyer agency. In today's world, everybody understands the benefits of buyer agency, and we don't have to convince agents to get into that relationship. There are good reasons to keep a customer relationship, but there are far more reasons to practice buyer agency. Some buyers assume that they're being represented by the agents. For a good example, any buyer that you get that's moving from Illinois, that's the relationship in Illinois. It's basically an assumed agency. If you're working with a buyer, you're a buyer's agent. You're working with a seller, you're a seller's agent. And there's not necessarily a required buyer agency form to be signed. So you have to educate buyers sometimes from other states that this is the way it's done in Wisconsin, that we actually have a contract that needs to be signed. When you have buyer agency, you have the freedom to use your negotiating skills, which I highlight as your highest skills in servicing a client, and use the real estate statistic information. You can build better relationships. You maintain your natural relationship, especially with family and friends, first-time buyers. They really need your negotiating. They really need your support. Your buyers, your sellers, if you have a listing and now these sellers are out looking for a new property, it's much better to have a buyer agency relationship with them. Relocation buyers, they need that extra support and extra help. You can be held liable if you give customer agent representation when you are a sub-agent of the seller listing firm. So make sure that if you are not a buyer's agent, but you act like one, you're subject to being held liable by the listing firm, saying you're not representing who you're supposed to be representing, which is us. You can only really represent and negotiate for your buyer when you are a buyer's agent. Otherwise, as a sub-agent, you're representing the seller. The instances where you really shouldn't offer buyer agency, it's a freedom. It is a above and beyond service, but you may run into some buyers who you know will not be loyal. They're out hopping around open houses. They're calling for sale by owners. They're doing all sorts of things behind your back and talking to other agents. Those people, you want to just let them go. When a buyer has some really unrealistic demands, something that you really can't re-educate them to the realities of the market, they want to buy a, $125,000 house along the lake, or something like that, and you just say, I can't help you. Buyer who exaggerated expectations, that kind of thing. So you have to have a good relationship, obviously, with the buyer and somebody that will listen to your guidance. So let's see, when is buyer agency introduced? It used to be at the very first meeting with somebody. You had to choose one or the other. Right now, that's not true anymore. But you do have to introduce the choice. When you're first meeting with the new buyer, you have to talk to them about the choice of buyer's agent or being a customer of you. And explain, give them the form, let them think about it, but they don't have to sign it or make that decision right away. I believe we earn our money basically on our skills of negotiating. The more skills you have in negotiating, the more valuable you are to clients. So it's something that you develop. I've always said if you've been a parent of young children, you're probably already good at negotiating because they're excellent at negotiating. But it is a skill to learn in real estate, to know the figures, the statistics, the facts, and to be able to position your client in the best light. That's what earns you your commission. The buyer can sign the buyer agency agreement when the buyer is ready to write an offer, says, okay, here, I've chosen this house. We're going to write an offer. I want you to be my negotiator. I want you to be my representative. And they sign the buyer agency agreement at that point. They can even sign it, making it exclusive just to that property if they want to be off on their own if they don't get this property. But they can also sign the buyer agency agreement earlier if they want your guidance while you are showing them properties, talking about their market value and talking about the pros and cons for that need. So it's up to them, but make sure that they understand the choice at the beginning. Any questions on that? So the comparison of duties to the customer and the client, I have listed them out here, and it's something that I want you to understand. And when you are talking to a new buyer, especially a first-time buyer, you want to be able to, geez, I'm going to get this out. Okay. You want to be able to talk about the differences and the additional benefits of being a buyer's agent for them. So, and again, stress the skill that you have for negotiating for that client. You will not place their interests under yours. So you have a duty as a fiduciary duty to always put their interest ahead of yours or the seller. I developed a example of when you are in a buyer agency agreement, you are actually in the boxing ring. Your seller is being represented by the listing agent, and your client is being represented by you. And you and the listing agent are the ones inside the ring, boxing and negotiating for a win-win situation. And as you can see, the seller and the buyer outside the ring, observing your negotiating skills. You're obviously working with your client to what they want, but you are doing the negotiating directly. If you don't have buyer agency, the buyer's agent is outside, the customer's agent is outside the ring, and the buyer is inside the ring boxing with the listing agent. Not many customers want to be in that position. So this is that example. The seller still is outside the ring. You are working with this buyer as a customer. You are outside the ring with the seller, and inside boxing is the listing agent, who is very skilled, and your customer. So when you're showing just this simple diagram to your buyer, it shows them the understanding what the benefits of buyer agency. I developed this chart a while ago, and I occasionally read over it and update it, but it's a nice chart, and we do have it in our list for listing of giving sort of a chart on what the advantages are of a sub-agent and the advantages of a buyer's agent. And you can see all the extra services you can provide to a buyer when you are a buyer's agent. And again, I want to stress that negotiating is the one that's highly questions about between a customer and a client. Everybody okay with that? Good. When you're talking with your buyer about the buyer agency agreement, as I said, you can give it to them at first meeting and let them read over it, take it home. Making sure that they really understand it. And I think that's what we are striving to do today. You give them the education of how to be your client. You are in this agreement being loyal to the real estate agent who they've signed on as their buyer's agent. You remind them that if they do go to open houses, they are only to give your name at the open house, that you are in a buyer's agency agreement with Joan Reed at Keller Williams. You always are referring back to your buyer's agent for information, for possible ideas. You talk about the subject of for sale by owners. Do you want to be their representative if they look at for sale by owners? That means, in addition to looking through all of MLS for properties that might suit them, that you're also looking at all for sale by owner sites. You're looking in the newspaper. You're looking in the for sale by owner sites in MLS. You're driving around the blocks and looking for sale by owner signs out in front. If you additionally say that you are going to help them find for sale by owners as well as MLS listed properties, you have to make sure that they understand what that means. And another situation with that, with for sale by owners, sometimes the for sale by owner does not want to pay a real estate agent for anything. Not even if you bring in a good offer. They refuse to pay for the real estate commission to the firm of that agent. And so this is where the education of the buyer agency agreement means that if they buy a property, that your agent doesn't get commission paid by the seller, or a smaller agreement than what you have signed in your buyer agency. Say it's listed in MLS, but they're only offering 2% instead of 2.4, or in some cases they're only offering 1%. We're getting pretty, pretty suspicious. Sometimes now people are saying they're not going to pay a buyer's agent anything. And that means that the buyer agency agreement becomes the responsibility of the buyer to pay that buyer's agent's firm the commission, the 2.4, basically. Depends on what you have in your buyer agency agreement as compensation, as success fee, as what you are paid. But the responsibility is on your buyer if you don't get paid that amount. It's very, very clear that we have to discuss this. And I think this is where the update on this slide presentation comes in. Because of the lawsuits across the country, regarding non-transparent discussions of what the buyer actually owes to the firm of the agent, it caused this uproar and these lawsuits. We have Keller Williams nationally has settled with the lawsuits, but it means that we are continually be transparent, very open with our buyers on what the responsibility is when they sign this buyer agreement.
Joan, I have a question.
Sure.
Do we still have a governance as to what our fees must be? Or do we now have full autonomy with what we can negotiate with our client for compensation on the buyer or seller side?
Well, there's nothing hard written about this. From my discussions with Keller Williams, it's basically if you're capped, it's your business decision. If you're not capped, you still have to cover the amount that you owe, the 30% that you owe Keller Williams.
There's a minimum, right?
There's a minimum, right?
Okay.
But you have to be cautious here. My experience working with agents and being an agent myself for a long time, it's very difficult sometimes for an agent to make this discussion with the seller. And it is something that you must do now. You have to be very transparent on what the buyer is saying. More and more consumers of properties, buying houses, are more comfortable and understand more about buyer agency. And I think most buyers know enough about buyer agency that they demand it. But you have to stress the fact that you also, with this demand of buyer agency, you take on the responsibility of compensating the buyer's agent firm if the buyer agent isn't covered, according to the terms of the agreement. And sometimes that's a hard discussion. You know, some buyers over the years have said, well, yeah, I want to be represented by an agent, but you know, do I have to pay anything? And a lot of agents used to be pretty timid about saying, well, kind of, you know, only in this situation. But our buyer agency agreement is pretty clear. It's in bold. It's in big, fat, black print in there on what the buyer owes to the firm of the buyer's agent if the buyer's agent isn't compensated by the seller or by the listing firm.
Do we now have an additional form that we need to have them sign, correct?
No, we did have an additional form that we added to our list last November, December. But then January 1st, the brand new buyer agency form came out with the additional wording about being transparent, and the new listing agreement came out with that additional verbiage about being transparent. So we don't have to add that CBA or a CL.
Okay.
Okay.
So
and I saw that it's still on the list in the checklist, and I'm trying to get that taken off.
Okay, thank you for clarifying.
Sure. The new forms say it all.
Okay.
Okay. So you have to explain how you're compensated, and you have to explain the amount and when, if ever, the client will be responsible to compensate you. So as I said, the new agreement came out January 1st of this year. and it's worded to further improve the consumer transparency regarding commissions. It indicates that a variety of commission mode and new business models exist. There is no firm commission that they have to pay. There is no firm amount that they have to pay. Make sure as a client, as an agent of Keller Williams, you don't say, our compliance broker makes us get at least 6. Don't say our compliance or our company or Keller Williams makes us that we have to get a certain amount. You can talk about a minimum, but a minimum amount of percentage, but you can't say that it's up to, you're being told by your company that you have to get a certain amount. You have to remember, underlying everything, that all commissions are negotiable. Now you have an agreement with Keller Williams to have a minimum, but you still, it doesn't prevent you from having to negotiate what the buyer is willing to pay you. And this is where the conversation gets a little strained sometimes, or a little difficult for you to do. But what you have to do is just like when you're taking a listing, you have to prove your value. You have to prove your worth. You don't take less just because the buyer client or the seller client insists on paying less. You have to make sure that you can project, understand, and communicate how valuable you are. And this is where we get back to negotiating, how valuable your negotiating skills are. That arm's length negotiation is prevalent in our culture. Movie stars, singers, businessmen all have agents, because the best negotiating setup is with an agent representing the clients. Arm's length negotiation is much more successful than direct negotiation. So when you are presenting your buyer agency agreement, or when you're presenting your listing presentation, you have to add in there what your value is, why you earn this commission, why this is the only way you are compensated for all the work that you do. You do not get a salary, you do not get extra money, you earn your commission and your value at the closing table. And these are very important conversations to have with your client. And the more you practice this, and the more you develop your confidence in delivering this message, the better off you'll be. So again, in learning all of this that's happened, we in Wisconsin are better off than most other states, because we do have a formal buyer agency agreement that needs to be signed by the firm and by the client. As I said, state of Illinois does not, it's optional. There are other states, I'm not sure all of them, but there are other states where it is an assumed agency. There's no written agreement. And therefore, there was much less explanation of buyer responsibility on the buyer agency agreement. And therefore, with that lack of transparency, a lot of buyers start realizing that they were being charged more than they thought they were going to be charged. And that's the root of that lawsuit that came up. So again, we were protected by this WRA in the state of Wisconsin, that we have this form, that it is required in order to practice buyer agency, and that it has the built-in language that is transparent to the buyer, so that they understand what their responsibilities are. Any questions about this? Again, I refer back to this legal update. I'm going to show it backwards, but it's about 12 pages from the WRA, just came out January 24. It's A to Z, is it? Everything about buyer agency. It's a good thing just to keep in your files, keeping saved in your private documents, and that you can refer to at all times. And remember, you can also refer to Steph or me at all times if you have particular questions about buyer agency or going into a buyer agency agreement or things like that. But this last slide, it says, what should the buyer's agents advise their clients regarding commission? Buyer's agent should discuss the amount of commission to be paid by the buyer to the buyer's firm. Remember, the agency agreement is with the firm, Keller Williams, and you being an agent of that firm are one of the agents representing in that buyer agency agreement. Buyers should be aware that any amount of compensation is negotiable. It should be clear that the buyer is responsible for paying the buyer agency fee, and that if owned by the buyer may be reduced or eliminated by what the firm is offering. So in MLS, if they're offering 2.4% upon successful closing, and your buyer agency agreement says that you are to, Keller Williams is to be paid 2.4%, the buyer doesn't pay anything because you're being compensated by the listing firm. If you're working with a personal buyer who chooses to pay you, then the buyer is obligated, responsible to pay you your 2.4%. And
Okay, Joan, that's that payment though that they're responsible to pay is to the firm, not us, correct?
right, and then you get your portion of the firm.
So
Of the
when we're
commission.
so that's where I think I got a little confused starting out, trying to determine what our minimum is that we're allowed to indicate that the buyer owes the firm. So if we're talking and we're negotiating and the buyer's like, I don't feel comfortable with having to owe 2.4%, where do we get the information to know what our limits are with negotiation on behalf of the firm for the firm's compensation?
Well, on the buy side, it is understandable that we in MLS generally get 2.4%. You can explain, you can prove your value to your buyer on what percentage you will get. If you're going lower than 2% on that buyer agency agreement, I would suggest calling me or Steph or Mandy or Charlie or Josh or anybody if you can go to that lower amount. But again, this is between you and the firm. It's not between your client and the firm. You have to present the fact that you're not being forced to stay at this amount, but you have to use your negotiating skills to get that amount, or you get permission in that reduced commission form that you can go lower. And that's what that reduced commission form is. But again, that's between you and the firm. It's not between you and the buyer and the firm.
So I'm seeing myself as the middleman between the buyer and the firm because the buyer agency agreement is between the buyer and the firm, not the buyer and myself.
Right.
So if I'm trying to negotiate on behalf of the agency's fees, then I'm taking myself out of the equation. I'm just trying to negotiate that compensation between the buyer and Keller Williams, and indicating that their fee is 2.4%, but we can negotiate, down to a certain amount depending on the circumstance.
Yeah, but
So I'm kind of
you are the agent that's going to be providing the services. You are the
Correct.
agent that's going to be doing the negotiating.
Yeah.
And you have to show your value to that buyer to pay that amount. If that amount is lower than your agreement or your guidance with Keller Williams, you either have to negotiate higher with that buyer, or you have to give that amount up in order to work with this buyer. and not demand be covered, or change the buyer agency agreement. But you would need on your side, because you are designated agent for Keller Williams in this buyer agency agreement, you're the one doing the work. And you don't do your work for free. You don't.
Right, right. Because whatever they don't agree to pay is coming out of my commission portion.
Either that, or you can negotiate it up a little bit more. Right.
Got
But
it.
if it's below, I would say if it's below 2%, just call me, call Steph, call, and just say, or present that form of permission to reduce commission.
Okay.
Okay. But
Thank
we
you.
like to take it more on a one-on-one basis rather than have something in firm in writing and saying, that we don't allow anything under such and such.
Yeah.
So you're going to negotiate with a firm, you're going to negotiate with your buyer, but the idea is to provide your services and provide your worth, your value.
Right. Right. As part of the negotiation.
Right.
Yep.
Yeah,
Okay,
but
thanks.
please don't throw it in the firm's lap and say, well, the firm makes me do this. So otherwise I have to call my broker. I mean, you're
Yeah,
giving away your value that way. You're saying,
it's like,
I have to do what they tell me.
well, that's what the car salesman says. I gotta go talk to my manager.
Well, we're not car salesmen. True. Any other questions about this? It is something you need to practice. You have to hone negotiating skills. You have to be confident in your presentation. Buyer agency is a wonderful, wonderful way to practice real estate, because you have all the freedom to do your best instead of putting it off and trying to represent the seller when you're actually working with the buyer.
I just wanted to add that I found it helpful to download the brochure from the WRA's site through Zip Forms and actually give that brochure in an email to the buyers so that they can read what the benefits are of buyer agency.
Very good, Tammy. I'm glad you brought that up. WRA.org is such a helpful site on that. There's all kinds of videos to help you practice buyer agency, all kinds of downloads and things like that you can do. And as I said, these legal updates that come out monthly are really valuable pieces of information. And this one for January 24 is all about buyer agency. So Steph and I are always ready. I taught buyer agency for almost 20 years at my previous firm. And I'm a big proponent of it, but I'm also a big proponent of the agents understanding what that obligation is and how to perform it. Any questions? Unmute yourself and just ask me any questions if you have any.
Hey, Steph, I actually put this in the group chat, but I can ask it out loud. Or sorry, Joan, sorry.
Oh, that's all right. I haven't checked chat. Yeah, go ahead.
So in the case that the buyer does end up being responsible for paying the commission, have you seen that they're able to somehow like roll it into their mortgage? Does it maybe just depend on the lender, since it might be a good chunk of change up front for them?
I don't know that for a fact. I would ask a lender, or I would have your buyer ask their lender to see if they could bundle it in. I really don't have any answer. I don't know. I haven't heard of it. But is the Keller Williams minimum 5%? As I said, there's nothing set in stone. We really like to take them on a case-by-case situation. I've heard Charlie talk about 4.5%, but again, it's not written. It's you could refer to your ICA on what that says, and also on the actual form that has reduced the permission to reduce commission. And that's in zip form. Where can I find a copy of the legal update? I didn't have a chance to link it. As I said, just go to wra.org and there's a category just for legal updates, and go in there and get the latest one. And it's a good place to know where to go to get these, because they're valuable, and every month is a completely different topic, and it's in depth in many ways. That's the chats. Any other questions? One thing I want to bring up, I've been on professional standards panel for a long time, and when we hear cases for procuring cause, you know, who is the real agent to be able to get the compensation for representing the buyer, and there's never any direct answer, yes or no. It's not an answer that's black or white. It is something that you have to hear both sides, and then the panel makes a decision on procuring cause. Procuring cause is like, who is the person that actually brought the buyer to a successful closing? A lot of agents, especially newer agents, are under the misunderstanding that if they have buyer agency with a buyer, that ensures them of procuring cause. It doesn't. So if your buyer toodles off to an open house, most open houses should be isolated from procuring cause, because they should be open houses. But if your client goes to an open house, likes it, wants to bring her husband or his wife back into the house and see it later or see it the next day, and makes an appointment with that person at the open house, that person at the open house pretty much has procuring cause. And the agent will then call me or call Steph and say, no, I have procuring cause because they're a client of mine. I have a signed buyer agency with them. Well, I'm sorry, that does not protect you from a procuring cause situation. And just remember that. It's a big misunderstanding that a lot of agents, especially newer agents, haven't learned yet. And you don't want to learn it the hard way. So the cure for that is in your buyer agent consultation. You explain to them how they are always supposed to go back to you. If they go to an open house on their own, they just give your name only at the open house, say that they're in a buyer agency agreement, and that listing agent will leave them alone. They should leave you alone.
Are they still on the hook though to pay our firm a commission, even if they went to an open house and that agent wrote an offer to purchase that got accepted?
Just what we were talking about. Of course they are. And it's hard to collect because a lot of times Keller Williams will say, oh, we don't want to cause hard feelings or things like that. But there are times when it's pretty egregious and pretty intentful, and pretty much like, I don't care what I signed, I'm not paying you, kind of a thing. We will go after them. But a lot of times Keller Williams will pass on insisting that they pay. That doesn't mean that you are excused from saying that they are not responsible for compensating. Make sure that they are clear that this is what the buyer agency agreement says up front. So you don't have those situations come up later where you have to be arguing with them saying, you have to pay me, Keller Williams, you have to pay Keller Williams my commission. That's not the time to be arguing. The time is to educate it up front, saying that this is what the agreement is. It's in bold print, it's under caution. It's quite clear in the buyer agency agreement, and it's up to you to stress that, so that they don't go out with a listing agent, or they don't go out with another agent to look at other houses and buy through that agent and then have to be responsible for paying Keller Williams the commission in addition.
Okay, thank you.
I've seen it all ways. I've seen it where we have gone after the buyer for the compensation according to the buyer agency agreement. And I've been in situations where we've graced it. And, you know, the circumstances really were not their choice or whatever. But again, it's something you look at, but at the introduction of buyer agency agreement, I would not imply that we may forgive that. Any other questions? Just unmute yourself and just ask a question or put something in the chat. I'm really impressed by the turnout today. Thank you all for coming in on this. It is something that's important and even more important now because this light has been shown on the real estate profession. And it's something that we believe in and that we will certainly understand the importance of this light that was shown. So.
Have you heard any agents reporting any adverse responses from having more in-depth commission conversations now?
I haven't heard. I've fielded a couple of questions about an agent before going into that conversation, you know, some of the suggestions of what to say. And, you know, basically what you say, and like this last slide here, what should you advise them? That make sure that no amount of excuse me, commission is negotiable. You have to say, you have to be transparent. This is what, if we put this down in this buyer agency agreement, this amount of compensation is what you and the firm and I have agreed to. That's our agreement. But in discussing it, the amount that we put down in the agreement is negotiable. It's not firm. And you take that responsibility on yourself to express why it's 2.4 or 3 point, 1.5 or whatever you say is something that you earn, that you have the value to provide that service. So you can negotiate it, but then you hold firm. It's the same thing in listings. You know, 6% is not mandatory. 6% for a listing is negotiable. And you have to make that clear to a seller that it's negotiable. But then in order to get 6%, you have to explain to the seller why you deserve 6%, why you and Keller Williams deserve 6%. It's not automatic. It's not something that I have to ask because my broker told me to. It's why you, as the agent, will be the best listing agent for that seller and why you deserve to be compensated at 6%. If you can't, you can negotiate something lower. If it's lower than 4.5, you have to get a form with Keller Williams, not with the seller. You have to get a form signed with Keller Williams, permission to reduce commission. And again, those are taken on a 1-by-1 situation. So again, the buyer agency agreement and the listing agreement are very similar. They're counterparts. Any other good questions? Okay. Well, again, feel free to call me if you're in a situation where you want a little more clarification. Check out WRA.org. Look for the legal update, January 2024. And I'm always ready for your questions.